Here is the fourth lecture in an overview of African American history, and this lecture primarily will focus on the antebellum period, particularly after about 1815 up to about 1830. This period is marked by a rapid increase in slavery expansion to the West, and that is a function of cotton. Cotton production advances rapidly because of the invention of the cotton gin, which came about in 1793 thanks to a Connecticut Yankee living in Georgia. Cotton was a product that was very much grown in early America, but not grown on a large scale because you had to sit and pick the seeds out of the cotton fibers by hand. And so it was a long, laborious process, and who wants to do that? But after the invention of this cotton gin, which removed the seeds rapidly from the fibers, farmers start growing less tobacco, less rice, and less indigo as the new economy is geared around cotton. So as cotton production increases, more and more Southerners start expanding west to get more land for planting cotton. And then, of course, you need more slaves for growing and picking and processing the cotton. But all of that would not have created a massive expansion of slavery and cotton to the West had it not been also for a simultaneous industrial revolution. This industrial revolution happening starting in the 1790s and really running all the way to 1900 is a process of factory and machine growth in the United States that brings the creation of textiles to the northern United States, and thus gives cotton growers a place to sell their product. So a lot of the cotton will end up going to England, which has textile machines, but also to northerners as well. Here we can see the model of the cotton gin as it worked. This would be a crank that would turn with a handle. The cotton would go inside here and then be pulled along with these rows of teeth against a series of brushes. And that process of pulling the cotton between the two would result in the removal of the seeds from the fibers. As the map shows, cotton production then becomes exceptionally important all the way through the South, but particularly in this area running through South Carolina all the way down to Texas. This area has very fertile soil, good for growing cotton, and so it becomes known as the Black Belt of cotton production. Once grown and packaged, a lot of it would be shipped out of Mobile, New Orleans, Savannah, and then taken either to England or to New England, up here to factories, textile factories that are starting to be built in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. So a lot of people think about slavery and think about, well, it's just limited to the South. But in fact, the industrial growth of the North also depends on slavery as well. So these factories in the North, as well as in England, started to produce a large amount of cloth, creating a higher demand for cotton. And as that happened, Southern farmers kept moving west in search of new lands, more areas to grow cotton. Production rose dramatically about, let's say about 1815 on up to 1860, creating this cotton belt across the South. it became America's most valuable product. So much so that 60% of all exports of the United States in 1860, the value of those exports was cotton. One famous Southern governor and legislator, James Henry Hammond, gave a speech in 1858. In the speech, he basically said, "Cotton is king. It is the king of the South, and that no one dares mess with cotton. It's that powerful, generates that much money." Indeed, by 1860, the value of all the slaves in the United States owned by the Southerners would be $3 billion. So here's an illustration of slaves ginning cotton. And if you've ever wondered why it's called the gin, that's actually short for engine. Except cotton gin, people say that really fast, and you stop saying the N part. Cotton gin instead of cotton engine. The slave population expanded pretty rapidly, which should make you start thinking about where are these slaves coming from. By 1840, there's 2.5 million. By the Civil War, there's going to be just over 3 million slaves in the southern part of the United States. So where are they coming from? Who owns them? Only about 1/4 of white Southerners own slaves. 3/4 of the Southerners do not own slaves. But before you think too much about that, just remember that slavery is important to the entire Southern economy, even for people who don't own slaves. Because at some point in your life, every Southerner thinks, well, I might own a slave one day. So it's in my best interest to preserve slavery and the system of slavery. Most slave owners in the South own 5 or fewer slaves. There's not that many people who own 20 or more. But those 20 or more owners are the planters, the great planters. And they are the most politically powerful people in the South. They run all of the Southern governments. They tend to dominate Southern counties and courts and legislatures. They make the South follow their ideal order and protect slavery. So here's just an illustration of more African American slaves working cotton fields. Notice the overseer, always on horseback, watching to make sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing, not being lazy, not being slowing down, not being damaging to the equipment. So if you were kind of thinking, well, where did they get the new slaves? That is definitely going to be an issue for Southerners. Because before 1808, you could buy slaves from Africa or the Caribbean. The international slave trade is still open. But January the 1st, 1808, a ban goes into effect. Now, some slaves still continue to arrive by smuggling, so illegal means are used to bring slaves in the United States. But the way that Southerners get slaves for this cotton boom is through the domestic slave trade. That is, encouraging slaves to have children, breeding slaves in order to get more slaves, and then rounding up slaves to take them down south for sale. Many of the rounding up spots were older East Coast cities like Baltimore and Charleston, places where slavery is starting to not be as important, and where the economy is slowing down. So extra slaves in those areas would be rounded up and then sold down the river to Alabama and Mississippi. And the phrase down the river is what every slave fears, that they'll be split off from their family and sold down south. Down the mighty Mississippi to the cotton fields of Texas, Alabama. Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, was also one of the gathering spots for excess slaves to be sold, so then they could be taken down south. Here is a group of slaves being taken to an auction, a coffle as it would be called. They're chained and whipped and being forced to walk down to a sale, probably in Kentucky or Tennessee, and then eventually taken to Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. Ads for these auctions and sales are very common that you can find, and they will always feature the names of the slaves with a description of their abilities, with any problems they might have sometimes, age, those sorts of things, so you know how long you're going to get more work out of them. This is a map showing the drainage of slaves from the northern areas down south. So the areas in red see a decline in slaves, that is, slaves being sold. And you notice it's all of these older states of the eastern coast, places where tobacco had been grown, and now that's not as popular. So now they're getting rid of extra slaves, and instead they're going down to Alabama, to Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, and then eventually Texas in the 1830s. Here's an ad for a sale of slaves, and I think it's worth looking at because it just is very shocking to the way we think about people and humans, to put prices on people and to talk about them as a commodity. That way of thinking is so odd to us, and yet that was the way they thought about slaves, the way Southerners, the way white people thought about slaves in the antebellum American time frame. So here, Lunesta, she's 27, she's a rice planter, $12.75. If we convert that into modern equivalents, that's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $40,000 to $47,000 for this person. So that tells you how much slaves are valued. Lizzie, on the other hand, is 30, but she's got some kind of problem. She's unsound, so they're only going to charge $300 for her. What strikes me as just absolutely crazy is that you get down here, number 19 is a 1-year-old infant, strong, likely boy. How do they know he's going to be a good worker? You don't know. He's worth $400, even more than the unsound 30-year-old. Notice that they include people who are good at cotton, good at rice, people who are good at cooking, carpenters, handy in the house, a blacksmith. All of these slaves have something that's marketable as a skill about them that can help drive up the price. Another thing that you can take a look at is that the names for the slaves. And scholars have done a lot of work on these names to figure out where they come from. Do they reflect family traditions? Do they reflect African traditions? Are they names that the slaves themselves came up with, that their owners came up with? You see a lot of different variations. Religious names like Maccabee or Dorcas Judy, which are both biblical names. And then classical Greek names like Theopolis, which is city of God, or Virgil, an ancient Roman poet's name. Minda, for example, could be derived from an ancient African name. So scholars have spent a lot of time looking at where these come from to see what it tells us about life among the slaves. This illustration on the side here shows a slave being examined and inspected, and this is a little bit too modest because he's got clothes on. Typically the examinations were naked because the buyer wanted to inspect every single possible part of the slave for infection, for disease, for anything that could be a problem for the future of that slave. On the plantation, work, well, just an all-day affair from day clean, which is early in the morning when the sun rises up, to first dark. Day clean to first dark. And that would be with heat blazing down on you, back-breaking labor, bent over, weeding, digging, hoeing, you name it. Every plantation's different, though, and some slave owners drive their slaves really harshly, whippings and beatings, without any sort of concern for the humanity. On smaller farms, it's more likely that the owner of the farm worked directly with his slaves out the fields together, rather than having an overseer. Typically, the work week was 6 days. The day off would be Sunday for church, and that would be, to honor Christianity, since, people who own other human beings are so Christian. Get my sarcasm there. The conditions were pretty rough. Slave cabins were often built, depending on the wealth of the owner, depending on what those slave cabins looked like. Very simple clothes, often cheap, coarse fabrics, small food rations so that you might get a little bit of meat, salted pork, cornmeal, just enough to get by on. After the workday, of course, the slave still had his own needs. Maybe he kept a garden. Sometimes masters would allow that. He's got a family to take care of. Maybe they're small children. There are all kinds of other things going on in these people's lives besides just the work on the plantation. You might think that working inside the plantation house would be better. I mean, butler, cook, nurse. And yes, you'd have better food, better clothing and shelter, but your day would be 24 hours long. You'd always be at work, taking care of the master's children, cooking the food, cleaning. But you'd also be within striking distance for abuse. The masters were frequently psychologically and physically cruel to house slaves. Female house slaves were often the victims of sexual advances and rapes. And then the master, his wife, would often then punish you as well. Since she can't strike her husband, she takes her hatred of him out on you as the slave. The house slave lifestyle must have just been full of all kinds of awkwardnesses that people kind of just learned how to deal with. But if you think about them, it just seems strange, particularly in the fact that we have all these photographs of slaves being pictured with the family. So here is the slave who probably took care of these children. Maybe his wife had died, and so she's pictured with them. So that has to be odd to grow up with someone who looks different from you, taking care of you as a kid, but then later finding out you own them and you can abuse them and beat them. So that must create some psychological trauma for these kids to warp their minds. But then what about you as the slave taking care of these children as well? I mean, you were developing affection for them and care for them. Maybe deep down in your heart you resent them because they're the spoiled brats of your master. But you've still got to be, kind and careful, otherwise it could result in harm for you. So there must have been a great deal of psychological trauma and malfunction going on inside the planter's house. Outside of the planter's house, in their own slave cabins, slaves tried to maintain their nuclear families and marriages, even though there was always the present threat of being sold and having, being split from your children, split from your spouse. A key factor in helping them maintain their sense of humanity was religion. The hope for a better life in heaven. So gathering with everyone else, listening to the preacher, worshiping, singing. All this was an oral culture since slaves weren't allowed to read or write. So the world of religion focused on what was heard, what was said, rather than what was written. Musically, the songs that the slaves sang are the origins, basically, for modern American music. The jazz, ragtime, blues, rock and roll, all of those musical traditions would not have occurred the way they occurred without the slave spirituals, many of which we know a lot about how they were sung and the way that they were done, but a lot of them we don't. We know how they were arranged by white people later in the 19th century. Sometimes the spirituals just express religious feelings. Sometimes they're for emotional outlets. Sometimes it's for just keeping a steady rhythm for working in the field. Slave spirituals that we have today are largely collected by people in the late 19th century. So we know a great deal about them, but we don't always know exactly what slaves sang and how they sang it. We do know that they liked songs that helped them, subvert the power of the planter by talking about God's ultimate justice, or rescue, such as "Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land, tell, O Pharaoh, let my people go." We also know from many of these songs, the way that they were sung would be, because this is an oral culture, by someone leading out the first line and then people responding with that line, which is called lining out, or responding with a refrain. And that gives us the call and the response tradition. So for example, "Roll, Jordan, roll." Roll, Jordan, roll, roll, Jordan, roll. I want to go to the heaven when I die to hear Jordan roll. Oh, brothers, you ought to have been there. And then people go, "Yes, my Lord." So that would be a call and response. So notice the structure then repeats very similarly all the way through. "Oh, preachers, you ought to have been there. Oh, roll, Jordan, roll. Oh, sinners, you ought to have been there. Yes, my Lord." So the way these would be sung would be a format that would work for non-literate people. And then explains also their format today and how that evolves into, say, jazz and ragtime and the blues. There were some slaves who were literate. One of my favorites is a North Carolina slave named George Moses Horton, who as a child actually taught himself to read. If you can imagine teaching yourself to be literate. He loved hymns, he loved poems, and he started producing his own poetry. And people would love to listen to him. Students at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill would actually purchase love poems that he had written because he was so good. By 1829, he wrote a book of poetry called The Hope of Liberty. And he later wrote 2 more collections of poetry after the Civil War. So we're just going to look at one of his poems. This is from his 1829 book, The Slave's Complaint. "Am I sadly cast aside on misfortune's rugged tide? Will the world my pains deride forever? Must I dwell in slavery's night, and all pleasure take its flight, far beyond my feeble sight forever? Worst of all, must hope grow dim, and withhold her cheering beam? Rather let me sleep and dream forever? Something still my heart surveys, groping through this dreary maze. Is it hope? Then burn and blaze forever? Leave me not a wretch confined, altogether lame and blind, unto gross despair consigned forever. Heaven, in whom can I confide? Canst thou not for all provide? Condescend to be my guide forever. And when this transient life shall end, O may some kind eternal friend bid me from servitude ascend forever. Pretty sophisticated language and structure for someone who had to teach himself to read. Slaves tried to maintain family as best they could, tried to maintain father, mother, children, nuclear family structures. Marriage was common, not legal, but encouraged only because it would result in more children, which then would result in more bodies to sell. Plus, married slaves were seen as less likely to run away or rebel because you could have something to hold over their heads, their wives or their children. In the end, though, a slave and his marriage could be dissolved and he could be trucked off to some distant land if the owner died and the family gets split apart to pay the owner's debts. And then as a family, you're looking at the fact that parents have very little time to care for their own children. So you're going to rely on the elderly slaves who are incapable of working to do that. It's a world in which the family is under constant assault all the time, as far as slave families go. And so what's remarkable is that they keep trying to make family the center of life, even though at any moment it could be snatched away from them. As a reminder of the power that slave owners had, this is a painting found on the back actually of another painting called this is called Virginian Luxuries, and it just shows the white master's ability to not only whip his people, but then to sexually abuse them. So everything about the slave's existence is going to be influenced by the power of the man. Which is not to say that slaves don't fight back, because as we're going to see later in this lecture, they definitely do. Here's a graph showing slave populations increasing as well as free black populations. So what I want to talk about next are free African Americans, and particularly free African Americans who own other African Americans. Some free blacks in the South become quite wealthy and then own slaves as well. For example, William Ellison was born a slave, became free in his 20s, went into business, and by the time he was old, he had 60 slaves. In 1840, U.S. Census records show us that about 3,000, a little less than 3,500 African Americans own other African Americans. So why? What explains this? Well, you're most likely going to find this in southern towns and cities, where the African American in charge runs a business or a factory, and he uses other African Americans as a labor source. But what you're going to find also is that many of these black slave owners own people who matter to them. That is, they purchase wives and children in order to get them out of other people's hands. And because it was very much impossible to free their wives and children, the next best thing was owning those people you cared about. Free blacks in the North had, well, relatively speaking, a better life. And the North was often seen as the land of freedom. Voting was allowed in many places, but not always, and sometimes mobs would prevent it from happening. Jury service could happen, more career choices, greater freedom of movement. But still, there's widespread discrimination. White people in the North have no thought that African Americans are equal to them. They don't consider blacks as equal. The prejudice shows in the fact that in Philadelphia's concert halls, African Americans are not admittance. Sorry, I can't talk. Churches are segregated. Public transportation denies. So you will see segregation in the North. And you will also see, as we get closer and closer to the Civil War, many northern states putting limits on black political rights, such as voting. For example, in 1807, New Jersey took away the right to vote for free African Americans. Pennsylvania did it in 1838. Both Connecticut and New York put voting restrictions on. And all that occurred at the same time as southern states were also removing that right. For example, North Carolina in 1835 took away the rights of free African American men to vote. In the North as well, that did not make you safe from being kidnapped. Slave traders, ever in search of more bodies to take down south, could appear up north and kidnap free African Americans off the streets of northern cities. The rejection of planter power was common across the South. And we like to focus on revolts a lot because they're the big, most violent example of rejection of planter power. One of the earliest is Gabriels Conspiracy, 1800, but it never takes place. It would have been a massive slave revolt organized by Gabriel Prosser. He was a blacksmith, so he was hired out by his owner and traveled quite frequently, recruited about 1,000 people to join the revolt. They were going to storm the arsenal where weapons would be stored in Richmond, so then they could then take over the entire state, except a rainstorm delayed the crossing over creeks into Richmond, and then 2 slaves spilled the beans about the plot, which then authorities then acted quickly to round up the slaves, including Gabriel. And that should make you sort of pause for a moment. Why would slaves tell on other slaves? Well, they would often be rewarded. Sometimes they would be tortured. That alone makes it very unlikely that any slave revolt, massive ones like these, will ever be successful, because there's always someone who will blab. After Gabriel's Conspiracy, it was actually about 2 years of full-on panic among white people, and the states passed laws restricting the movement of slaves as a result. Here shows slaves escaping into the swamps, which was common in North Carolina and Virginia. There's a very giant swamp on the North Carolina-Virginia border called the Great Dismal Swamp. And so here they are trying to hide out and escape. They're being pursued in the back. Here's some scenes of rebels from other places. Saint-Domingue in the Caribbean. And you can see here the fear that whites have that the slaves will rise up and there'll be horrible attacks and murders and executions. Another slave, Denmark Vesey, earned his freedom by winning the Charleston lottery. He was a lay Baptist or lay Methodist speaker, so he was free and well regarded in the community. So he possibly planned a revolt in 1822 that was inspired by revolts in Haiti. The plan was supposed to be an attack on the city, which would be burned to the ground, the white citizens would be murdered, and then he and all the people that were freed would go to the Caribbean and join the Haitian rebels. Though historians in the last 10 years have doubted whether or not this was actually a planned revolt or not. And so we're kind of divided a historical community. The problem is that testimony taken after the supposed revolt was coerced by white people under force, which then means you can't be sure if you can really trust the testimony. 139 were arrested, including Denmark Vesey, and 34 conspirators were hanged to punish them and to discourage other slaves. In this, once again, this rebellion, same thing happened as before. Someone blabbed. We don't have any pictures of Vesey, but Charlestonians did erect a statue to him. You can see a picture of the statue here. And then an artist has drawn an image of Vesey as a preacher speaking to his people in Charleston. One of the most successful revolts is Nat Turner's revolt, 1831. Turner was a lay Baptist preacher, very deeply religious, had this vision of the heavens being filled with blood, and then that triggered him to start this rebellion and lead his people to freedom. He and his followers murdered nearly 60 white people at night, August the 21st, 1831. But quickly, white people rallied to fight back, round up the conspirators, and eventually captured Turner and executed him. As a result, there's paranoia among whites, and fear spreads throughout the South, which then make even harsher slave laws in response to try to stop all of these revolts from happening. A more successful revolt happened at sea, and that was the Amistad. The Amistad was a Spanish ship with slaves on it, in which the slaves, led by Joseph Sankey, rebelled in 1831, took over the ship, and then demanded to be returned to Africa. The U.S. Navy captured the ship. The slaves were taken then to the United States, and the slaves were put in jail. At trial, the question was, should they be allowed to be freed? And the Supreme Court, surprisingly, said they had a right to defend themselves and a right to rebel and to go away back to Africa. So this is one successful rebellion, though note it's not on land. Here's an illustration later drawn of Nat Turner being captured. He hid out for 6 weeks before he was found. Here's another contemporary illustration of the horrid massacre in Virginia, which Turner and his men executed lots and lots of Virginians, almost 60 Virginians, men, women, and children, as they slept. In truth, very few slaves took part in uprisings because they're just not successful. Somebody's going to blab. What works out better instead is just day-to-day resistance. Like, for example, breaking a hoe or pretending to be sick or doing anything to slow down the work on the plantation. Another thing that could be done would be to purchase your freedom or to escape and run away. Some slaves really worked hard to purchase their freedom, particularly if they were allowed to have their own side jobs going on, like growing vegetables. Lunsford Lane, for example, raised chickens and made pipes and eventually purchased himself. Benjamin Bradley invented things, sold them, and then brought his freedom. But my favorite story is Alethea Browning Tanner, who sold vegetables, and she bought freedom for herself and 13 of her family members through her labor, which should tell you how far slaves are willing to work to get their freedom. Here's a picture of Lunsford Lane. And we do have writings by him after the Civil War explaining his life and circumstances. Running away was a lot harder than you think. Mostly males did it, 18 to 35-year-old males, mostly more educated males who could play a long enough in public that people wouldn't suspect that they were runaways, who had enough knowledge to know how things worked and how to get to the North. Your average, not so intelligent person is probably going to be captured. There was a network of informal stops and places that slaves could find their way to the North through, called the Underground Railroad. And it could take you all the way to Canada if you needed to. These little stops and places were all over the United States, Kentucky, Ohio. People stayed and hid out in houses and barns. But in reality, the Underground Railroad was it wasn't a system that you could use very easily. It's not like there was a guidebook. Or a lantern in every window letting you know which house was safe and which wasn't. You really took risks in going to the North. It wasn't easy. The conductors took risks in hiding slaves because they could be arrested for taking in stolen property. They would hide slaves in their homes and then try to get them to the next station, tell them where to go. And a lot of the travel had to be done at night in order to escape detection. You can see here a lot of the routes to the north. Most of them are going to go through the Mississippi River Valley and up that way to get to Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Slaves in the upper South regions are the ones who are most easily able to run away because they're already closer to the north to begin with. And some make it all the way to Canada, recognizing that the only way they could be safe was to be in another country entirely. Harriet Tubman is one of the most well-known conductors of the Underground Railroad. She made multiple trips into the South to bring people to the North, often having to threaten them with a gun to keep quiet, to follow her lead, and to not betray anybody. This was a very perilous and at any moment you could be caught kind of situation. So it had to be done by somebody who was quick-witted and intelligent and knew what was going on. Historians estimate there are about 3,000 members of the Underground Railroad. Maybe 75,000 slaves escaped. It's hard to know for sure since all this is done in secret. One of the most well-known conductors is Levi Coffin and his family. It's a Quaker. He's a Quaker family in Indiana who helped about 2,000 slaves escape to the north. Here is Tubman, born a slave in Maryland, so a more northern state. And then she helped slaves escape from the South on 19 trips that she made herself. Other slaves made some very daring escapes to the north with some ingenious methods, like Henry Box Brown. You may have heard of him. Folded himself into a very small box and had himself mailed to Philadelphia. Didn't have but a few air holes and a pouch of water, so he almost died on this journey. It was a rough way to get to the north. My favorite is William and Ellen Craft. Ellen dressed as a white male planter who was sick and had an arm bandaged to disguise the fact that Ellen could not write. So her husband posed as her African-American body servant. So by using cross-dressing and their knowledge of white culture and white ways, they traveled on some very expensive dining railroad cars to the north and faked their way through white society to get there. Here's an illustration of Henry Box Brown, who would not have been popping up out of his box when he arrived. He was very nearly dead. One other way of ending slavery was discussed in the early Republic in the Antebellum period, and it was colonization. It was the idea that slaves would go back to Africa, though the back to Africa part doesn't make sense if you were born in the United States. Um, and they would create their own homes there, their own colonies. A famous black leader, Paul Cuffey, actually was one of the leaders in this. He took 38 people to the British colony of Sierra Leone in 1815. The reasons why this happened was because a lot of people argued that slaves, even freed, would never be able to fit into U.S. society. That U.S. society was for white people, and you just would not be able to get African Americans fully accepted, but they would be fully accepted in Africa. So in 1816, there was an American Colonization Society formed that would finance African Americans who wanted to go. They petitioned Congress for land and established a colony of Liberia. By 1830, about 1,200 black Americans went there to establish this new colony. About 10,000 people would eventually go before colonization was frowned upon. Here is a medal, a coin of the American Colonization Society, a ship, and a slave. Here is a map showing where Liberia is located. Notice it's on the coast of Africa, the coast, in fact, where many slaves would have been captured from originally, though not all, because some are from here as well. By 1817, a lot of free black Americans reject colonization because, for one thing, they weren't born in Africa. They have been born in the U.S., and they felt like that it was their belief that they belonged here. It was right for them to be here. And they also rejected the implicit racism in the American colonization movement. The racism that says black people cannot stay in the U.S. because they're black. The assumption then there is that white and African American people could never get along, and therefore there was no hope of creating a truly integrated society. And a lot of free blacks just didn't accept that. They thought that was, well, stupid, not to mention full-on racist. The other complications were the fact that free black people born in the United States were not Africans. They had no knowledge of African life and culture and society, so they would not be able to integrate back into that world. They would be treated as outsiders to the African people. So eventually what comes down to the debate over this issue is the morality of slavery itself. And what are we really going to do? Because colonization is not the answer.